Design systems is something that's very important when you're developing products, and it's something that I've been wanting to share with the team for a long time. And I've been thinking about what's the best way to do it, or how to explain the importance that design systems have in your workflow. So I came up with a few examples and a few metaphors that, to explain how design systems will help you accelerate and make your designs a lot more consistent. So what are design systems? Design systems are basically a collection of components, guidelines, all of the building blocks for any given design file or project. So it's basically all the buttons, all the forms, everything that you're going to use, all of the colors, all the typography, everything that you see visually in an interface. It's composed of different components that, when put together, make sense in the context of a product. I've been reading about this concept of atomic design by Brad Frost. The idea here is that you need to start by the most basic component in the entire system and start building up your complexity by combining those components and adding more stuff to them. So why do we need design systems? So first of all, consistency. When you use the same component over and over again, you're minimizing the risk of having a button looking different across many devices, or even across many screens of the same product. So using the reusable components is going to help you to always maintain that consistency in look and feel across all of the iterations of your product. Efficiency and speed. There are many components and interfaces that are repeated across basically the entire product, such as search bars and navigation bars, headers, icons. And if you have complex projects like more than, 100 screens, and you all of a sudden there's a change of requirements, you need to change an icon, and that icon is present in those 100 screens. Not having to use a reusable component is gonna cause you to have to go to each one of those screens and change it individually. And so even if it's a small change, that just changing it for one single screen is just gonna take you a few seconds, you multiply those few seconds for the amount of screens in the project, and then if you multiply that by the many times that you have to make changes to the entire collection of screens, you can see how it starts building up all of this inefficient changing and tweaking and modifying. That's really something that is not where we should be spending our time. So fix once, update everywhere. When you have a single source of truth, you just need to go to the source, change whatever you need to change, and it's going to be updated everywhere. Scalability. When your components are consistent and you know how they are always going to look, you can quickly go from one platform to the other. Let's say you develop a web product and then now you're going to launch a native app for iOS. Most of the components, even if you're not going to use the exact same component in some cases, they will dictate how the components in the new platform are going to look like. So the colors are going to be the same, the border radius are going to be the same, the shadows are going to be more or less the same, the colors are going to be the same. So it helps you to very quickly go to a new platform and start designing right away, because you're not starting from scratch. You don't have to start designing all the components again. Okay, so how do we build a design system? We start by the most basic unit. In the atomic design kind of like framework, we talk about atoms, because atoms is the smallest functional unit in nature, meaning it's the smallest unit that still makes sense to deal with. So in this case, we have common HTML tags like input button, labels, text area. We have also typography and colors. So I wanted to talk particularly about typography, because typography and our typographic system is going to tell us what the proportions for the entire interface are going to be like. So I like working with a 4-pixel grid. It just gives you a lot of flexibility, and you always know like the spacing that you need to add between elements, and you know the size that things should be. So it works really, really good with most other frameworks like Google Material Design or for Apple's guidelines. So I would recommend you start with typography, also because typography conveys a lot about the brand and the overall mood of the company. So It's once you get your typography selected, that's just gonna help you more quickly come up with many other components. So yeah, typography will give you a proportion, and it will give you it will contribute to the mood of the brand. And then there's a few rules, like if you just have the basic size and proportions of paragraphs, then usually for titles you just double that size to create some contrast. And there's other rules like font weight should be, usually you should skip a weight, meaning if you're using regular for paragraphs, then for titles you probably want to use semi-bold, which skipping the bold to create even more contrast. That's going to help to the overall legibility. So another very basic component that I would suggest you guys think about early in the design process, even before starting to design interfaces, is buttons. Just because they're so common. It's the most common way for the user to interact with the interface. So just get those down. Once you have colors and once you have typography, buttons should be pretty easy. Also think about the different states that buttons can have. Because the developers are also thinking that there has to be a hover state, so to indicate when like something's clickable. There has to be a press state to know that something has, especially important in mobile, because when you tap on something, there has to be some sort of feedback for the user to know that that button is actually doing something. I usually do primary, secondary. Rarely I do tertiary. I don't think it's very necessary sometimes. Most cases with a primary button and a secondary button, you'll be fine. And the rule of thumb is for the primary button, you want to use the accent color, so the main color of the brand. It's probably going to be the color of the logo, or it's going to be a color that's very frequent and used across the entire product. Here, actually, there's an interesting example because I also included icons inside the buttons, which add a little bit of complexity. So they're not atoms anymore. They're kind of like the next level in complexity. But it also depends the anatomy of a molecule. So a molecule is the next step in complexity if you're going from the most simple one to the most complex one. And it comprises a combination of atoms. So in this example here, we have a label, which is an atom. It's just typography. We have the input field, which is also an atom. It's just a basic HTML tag. And you have a button that it's another atom. So when you put those three together, it creates a more complex component that it's made out of simple atoms. And then you can take that, a thing like a molecule, and attach something simple like an atom or for a text area, and you combine those two and you have an organism. An organism, it's already something that already makes more sense for the user. It's something that they're going to be interacting with. It's not just some standalone component. It's something that has some functionality to it. And typically, it will comprise several molecules and several atoms. So an organism could be like a toolbar. It could be a header that usually will have the logo. We'll have some tabs. We'll have some links, maybe some menus. So those kind of like more complex components that comprise several more simple components are going to be the organism. Then when we have all of that, we have a pretty good solid collection of components that we can start using to put together pages for our product. So the next step in complexity here would be templates, or what we call wireframes. So it's just how you're going to organize the content in the entire page. So it's just good to, at this level, not think too much about the high fidelity stuff, but rather like think about where I'm going to place all of my components in a way that makes sense for the flow. And then the final stage will be just to grab that wireframe and just apply your system to it. So you can create what is going to be the final iteration for that screen or for all of the screens that you're going to be working on. Okay, so I wanted to talk about some of the things to keep in mind when building design systems. There's this metaphor that I found very interesting in that's called the workshop versus the storefront. So for instance, someone working in a workshop is usually going to be surrounded by tools, and depending what they do, it's going to be messy. They're going to have paint all over the place. But when you finish your product, you want to put them in a clean space that's well arranged, well lit, that looks great. That's going to be the storefront. So it's important when you're working as a designer to not lock yourself in a space in which you cannot explore and like try different ideas, see what works and what doesn't. So what I like to call this is exploring versus defining, and I'm stealing the idea from Matt Smith. And I saw this tweet, I think a month ago. He says that one of the biggest problems when people are struggling with design systems is that they are too focused on using just the components that they already created instead of like exploring new ideas and breaking stuff and seeing how they can solve a problem. You don't always have to work with the final components that you already designed. You can always remember to explore and try different ideas, and then once you have a very good solution, then you can see how you can incorporate that solution back into the system and update it. Illustrate the example of the workshop, and then this is someone who's painting or something. And then you have the gallery, like the one we were seeing yesterday, that looks completely different. You will not see splash of paint on the walls or brushes laying around. So keep in mind that, yeah, it's gonna be messy during the exploration phase, but that's the only way you can actually explore and break things and like kind of like let your creativity work. And once you figure it out, see how you can standardize your solution and fit it back into the system. So the system should not be this monolithic, very hard to modify thing. The system needs to be organic, needs to evolve with the product. So every time there's a new feature or every time you come up with a new component, you need to find ways to bring it back to the main system so everybody can use it, and even you can use it in the future for solving new problems. Now, collaboration. This is something that's very important. It's going to help you a lot when developing your own design systems. Which is to establish conventions for what you name your components, or what's going to be the hierarchy for components. I'm suggesting the atomic design model, but there are many other ways to do it. Exactly which framework you use for naming doesn't really matter. What matters is that everyone working with you understands and uses it. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of inconsistencies. So what I typically use is I will have the taxonomy, so it's going to be a button or an input field or some form of component that it's basic for any interfaces. The way I name the components is like this. So the taxonomy, so be buttons, input fields, or these basic components. Then the type, so it's going to be a primary button or secondary button, or yeah, depending on the type of component, you can have several types. And then the modifier, which is going to be the state, which applies for input fields, applies for links, applies for buttons, and for a few others. Putting this forward slash in between each one of those, let's say, levels, it's gonna, and this happens in every design tool, it's gonna create these folders to keep organize your entire system. So I'll show you an example later. But here what's happening is I have the library that's linked here in Figma, and then I have all of my components in the first level. So it's gonna be avatars, which is like user profile pictures, company logos. Then I have buttons, cars, Chrome extension, colors. So I added the division in a way that kind of makes sense for the project. And each one of them, they have subdivisions. So for buttons, we have UI buttons, which are all of the buttons that I'm using regularly in the interface. And action buttons are going to be buttons that are very specific to certain other components. So I didn't want to mix those two. And then inside buttons, again, you have primary with icon, secondary with icon, tertiary with icon. And then inside you have the state, so hover, default, disable, and active. So this is going to help you, first of all, keep everything organized, and second, it's going to make you work faster because you're not going to have all of these components basically laying at the same level of hierarchy, but you're going to have subdivisions that's going to help you search by using those categories. So it's a lot more efficient and a lot more organized. And also, if you're collaborating with other people, they're going to kind of like understand it right away because everything has its own place and its own category. So another important part about collaboration is communicating with engineering. So sometimes you may think, oh, I'm just going to do a prototype and it's going to be very clear. But truth of the matter is that developers don't always have time or want to check your amazing prototype. When they're working, they want to understand what is it that you were envisioning for the product and the interaction. And probably a prototype is just going to convey just a 20% more, but it's just not gonna get you 100% there because they still have to play around with the prototype and no one is explaining them what you were thinking. So they can click on stuff, they see the animation, but they don't understand why. So it's very important for you to make sure that your designs are understood by the development team that you're working with. So what I like to do is to add these explanations that sometimes look like a novel, but I mean, it's fine. If you get it, you don't need to read it. But if you actually don't get it, you will be very happy to see this very detailed descriptions. So I add the nodes below each artboard. Yeah, and for some components that change state, I will also add like a little instance of that component in a different state and explain what's the behavior that makes that component change. And also sometimes I like to add those target and click areas. That's gonna help you understand, because you can have multiple buttons and targets in a single page or interface, and I'm trying to refer to a very specific case here, so that's why I'm using the arrows. Okay, updating and maintenance. So I think some designers don't know this, but most design tools have some form of version control. At least in the case of Figma, it is integrated into the software. So if you click on that hamburger menu over there and go to File, you have version history here. And the way it shows you the version history is very similar if you guys have used Time Machine on the Mac, or if you guys have used, well, Google Drive. It's a very similar way. Actually, not Google Drive, Google Docs is the same way that it shows the versioning. The cool thing about this is that it's automatic, so you can go back, I think, as far as 30 days or something, which is really helpful when the client decides to change something 15 days after you had already a solution for that. So like, we fixed this 2 weeks ago, and now you want to revert back to that, and that happens very often. So you can just go to version history, browse to the date in which you more or less remember was the last time you updated that feature. You open that, you copy whatever you need to copy, and then you restore back the current version. And in order to like keep your sanity, you can give names to each version. So when you click on Save to Version History, should ask you to give you a name to that iteration. So you can name all of your iterations by date or by, I don't know, this is when we decided to change the color, so that you can reference back to your own way of organizing it. This is very helpful. I think for Sketch you will need to use Abstract, but well, Figma already has it. Another way, if you don't want to deal with Figma, or if for some reason the client does not have access to Figma, is to use version control in Google Drive. There's two ways to do this. One is to just use the built-in version control system in Google Drive, which is just you update a new version with the exact same file name, and Google Drive will say, okay, I'm saving this as a third version of this file. So when you open the folder, you only have one file with multiple versions. That for me is a little risky because you have to, well, not risky, but it's more like, it's a hassle to like open each one of the versions of that file and review it. So what I do, and what I was doing with Tiffany in Tenable, is that we actually save a copy of the new version with a date here, and we organize by date. We have unlimited space in Google Drive, so it's fine. We can do this. We can afford to do this. So we try to be very specific about file names. So you have these very long file names, but that's fine because when you're searching for them, it's going to be easier if you have very specific names as opposed to just having some, design file. That's just going to be harder to find. So yeah, we have the design system, and we have some color explorations also with a couple of versions. So this is another way to do it, especially if you're working with Sketch that has no version control built in. Another thing that I do, and this is something that was mentioned in one of the sessions yesterday, is that you should not share your working file with the client for two reasons. One is that they might get alarmed that things are not looking the way they expect them to look. Again, you're showing them your workshop. You don't want them to see your workshop. It's very messy. That's reason number one. And the other reason is that we just don't want them to have the final file because they can modify it. And if they can modify it, they can totally ruin our work. So what I do is I have my workshop file with me, and then I share something called the client delivery file. I think it was you who created that file for their development team. And the development team only sees that. Have a copy of the file, and that's gonna be the one that you're gonna be sharing with the client. And of course, you shouldn't give them editing permissions. You should be sharing the prototype version, and that also helps you to, forces you to make sure that the flows are in the right order, because otherwise the screens are gonna be all jumbled up. The delivery version of the file has these annotations, kind of like, I don't know if you guys have used GitHub before, but every time you commit code to a repository, you should be writing a description of what you're uploading. So that doesn't really exist in design tools, so I had to do it kind of like DIY. What I'm doing here is that I created this massive artboard. It's huge, it's really big. I think it's like 32,000 pixels height. And what I do there is that I add changes. So changes for every day that I update the file. So, and I also, I don't show this in the presentation, but I add a date to the name of the page inside Figma. So let's say the name of the page is like onboarding flow. I'll add the date there so they know when was the last time that I updated it. Maybe add an emoji or something. If they're Figma comments, there's no way to copy them. Even if you duplicate the file, I think the comments are gone. They're attached to the screen to that single file, the original one. So if you make a duplicate, you're gonna duplicate everything except the comments. This particular library I was working on started to get so big and so complex that it was just not sustainable to keep it inside that the original working file, particularly because we started to create new files for different purposes. So we created a demo file for them to go and raise funds with. We created a subset version for a subset of developers working in India that were only gonna be coding that specific part. So we have essentially different instances of the main file. So every time I needed to update something, I would only have my components inside my original working file, so I would have to update all of the others. And that only lasted like a few days before I went nuts. So I found a way to do, I found a workaround, which is actually the way I should have been doing it since the beginning, is you create your design library in a separate file, and then you just bring all of the components to each one of the files that you're working with.
Okay, how do you do that?
So you just create a new file, and then you make that file public within your team. And then everyone in your team has access to all of the components of that library. So if someone updates the main library, all of the instances of that component in all of the files that you're working with that library are gonna be updated. Exactly, it's the same model. Like for instance, if you have an application that has a mobile version, web version, and native version, they all exchange the data with the same brain, which is like the web server, right, David? So that's where you bring all of the data from. So it's the same thing here. You have a single source of truth, and all of the design files are bringing the components from there. Sure. I can open a file. I can actually open the library here to show you guys and walk you around the. I don't copy paste. You can actually search using Figma for those components on the left panel from your file, from your end file. Yeah, copy pasting works too, but takes you longer. So if it's originally a component, Figma will keep it as a component in the new file. Every time I update the delivery file, I let the developers know with a huge note. It's like, this is a very big artboard. And I let them know, since all of my screens and artboards have codes to them, I'll let them know. So look at OP71 to OP41 and OP62 and OP63. Those were the artboards that changed in this iteration, and this is why I updated. So they don't have to go and guessing what was the new thing that changed. They can just read my little note there, and they'll know exactly where to go. As I am working, I have my notes always open because I'll be referencing them because of some call or whatever, and I'll write down what I'm changing. Reference my notes and start crossing off the list what I already completed and write down what changed. So that would help me. Like most cases, I just copy and paste that into the notes and just change a little bit some words. This is a big file, and if you have to check every single screen every time something changes, the developer is basically going to waste half an hour or 1 hour seeing. Yeah, and if what you changed was you changed the border radius from 4 pixels to 5 pixels, imagine the developer trying to understand what you just did. It's like, yeah. Okay, so all of these things are going to speed up our workflow, make it more consistent, and make it more scalable. So what are you going to do with all of the spare time that you have? You're not going to be, because, you know, we usually, up until this point, we spend a ton of time changing colors, changing border radius, changing shadows. Oh, I don't like that red color there. I'm not feeling it, so we have to change it. We spend so much time updating components across the file that when we start using these tools, we're gonna shave off many hours of our day. So what are you gonna do with that extra time? So this is what we should actually be doing. Thinking in design terms how to help the business. So this is an example from an agency called Super Friendly. What they did is that they mapped out their entire sales cycle and as a kind of like this flow chart. And this is one of the examples of what you can achieve with design thinking for the client. You can get in conversations with them and understand what their business problems are besides the product, because you can apply the same design thinking principles that you're applying to solve product issues to marketing issues, to communication issues, to including internal communication issues that probably are not working. Like if you talk to their development team, or even if they have a design team, you can understand what their problems are in their workflow and think of ways to solve them by applying creative thinking. So this is just an example, but there's so many things that you can just Google some design strategy, and many, many examples will come up. So yeah, thank you.